The dust had barely settled on the corpse of Samuel Hewitt when Victoria Randall realized she would be blamed for his death, even though every person in the saloon had watched him draw first. Victoria stood in the center of the Golden Rose Saloon, her father's old revolver still warm in her trembling hand, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like a guilty verdict. Samuel Hewitt lay sprawled across the card table he had been cheating at for the better part of 3 hours, his blood pooling across the worn green felt and dripping steadily onto the sawdust-covered floor. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute, thick as molasses, broken only by the ticking of the clock behind the bar and the ragged sound of her own breathing. It was April of 1882 in Shafter, Texas, a silver mining town that had seen better days and worse men. The town sat in the harsh landscape of Presidio County, where the desert stretched endlessly toward Mexico, and the law was whatever the man with the most money or guns said it was. For the past 2 years, that man had been Marcus Hewitt, Samuel's older brother, who owned the largest silver mine, the only bank, and the loyalty of the sheriff who stood in his pocket like loose change. Victoria had known the moment she pulled the trigger that the truth would not matter. Samuel had grabbed her roughly when she refused his advances, had torn the sleeve of her dress and left bruises on her wrist that were already darkening. He had pulled his gun when she pushed him away. Every person in that saloon had seen it happen, but she also knew that in Shafter, Texas, the word of a woman meant nothing against the wealth and influence of the Hewitt family. The crowd that had filled the saloon began to move, a shuffling of boots and a murmuring of voices that grew louder with each passing second. Victoria saw the faces around her, some sympathetic, most carefully blank. These were people she had known her entire life, people who had bought bread from her mother's bakery, who had attended her father's funeral just 6 months earlier. Not one of them would speak for her when Marcus Hewitt came looking for revenge. "Someone better fetch the sheriff," a voice called out from the back. "And Marcus Hewitt," another added, the words carrying the weight of a death sentence. Victoria felt her legs begin to shake. The revolver suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She wanted to run, wanted to flee into the desert night and never look back. But where would she go? She had her mother to think about, her younger sister Clara, who was only 16. Running would paint her as guilty, would bring Marcus Hewitt's wrath down on her entire family. "Put the gun down, Miss Randall." The bartender, a weathered man named Pete who had been kind to her father, spoke gently. "Just set it down nice and slow." She did as he asked, placing the revolver on the nearest table with a hand that would not stop shaking. The moment the gun left her fingers, 2 men moved forward and grabbed her arms, not roughly but firmly enough that she understood she was now a prisoner. The saloon door swung open, and Sheriff William Crane walked in, his star catching the lamplight. He was a thin man with a sparse mustache and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. He took in the scene with a practiced glance, his attention moving from the body to Victoria and back again. "Well now," he said slowly, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Seems we have ourselves a situation." "Sheriff, he drew on her first," Pete said, stepping forward. "Samuel was drunk and got handsy. She defended herself." "That true?" Crane asked the room at large. A few murmurs of assent, but no one spoke up clearly. No one wanted to be the person who testified against a dead Hewitt. Victoria felt a cold dread settling into her bones. This was how it would be. This was how injustice worked in a town like Shafter. "I will need to take you in, Miss Randall," the sheriff said, finally looking at her, "until we sort this all out." "She should not be arrested," a new voice said from the doorway. Every head turned. Victoria found herself looking at a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the weathered look of someone who spent his days under the brutal Texas sun. He wore dusty trail clothes and a worn hat, and there was a quiet confidence in the way he stood, feet planted, hands resting easily at his sides. His face was tanned and angular, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She thought his name was Owen Young perhaps, one of the cattle drivers who worked the ranches north of town. This does not concern you, Young, Sheriff Crane said, irritation creeping into his voice. It concerns anyone who cares about what is right, Owen said, walking further into the saloon. His boots made solid sounds against the wooden floor, each step deliberate and measured. I was sitting right over there when it happened. He pointed to a table near the wall. Samuel Hewitt assaulted Miss Randall. He drew his weapon first. She fired in self-defense. That is the truth, and I am willing to swear to it. The sheriff's face tightened. Like I said, we will sort it all out. But she still needs to come with me. If you arrest her, you better arrest everyone else who has ever killed a man in self-defense in this town, Owen said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Or is the law different when the person defending themselves is a woman? A murmur ran through the crowd. Victoria stared at this stranger who was speaking up for her, putting himself between her and the sheriff's convenience. She had never seen anyone stand up to the law in Shafter, even when the law was clearly wrong. I am warning you, Young, the sheriff said, his hand moving toward his gun. Do not interfere with official business. I am not interfering, Owen replied. I am witnessing. There is a difference. Everyone in this room saw what happened. If you ignore that, if you arrest Miss Randall for defending herself, then you are not upholding the law. You are just doing Marcus Hewitt's dirty work for him. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sheriff Crane's face flushed red, but before he could respond, the saloon doors burst open again. Marcus Hewitt strode in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Marcus was everything his younger brother had not been. Where Samuel had been soft and spoiled, Marcus was hard as the silver he mined from the earth. He was in his early 40s with graying hair and cold blue eyes that could calculate the value of a man's life with the same ease he tallied his account books. He wore an expensive suit, even in the heat, and he carried himself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no. His gaze found his brother's body, and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or rage, or simply the cold calculation of loss. Then his eyes moved to Victoria, and she felt the full weight of his hatred. Arrest her, Marcus said. Not loudly, not with emotion, just a simple command from a man who expected to be obeyed. Now, Marcus, let us just take a moment, Sheriff Crane began, but Marcus cut him off with a look. My brother is dead. She killed him. Arrest her. It was self-defense, Owen said, stepping forward so that he was between Marcus and Victoria. Your brother attacked her. He drew first. Marcus looked at Owen as if he were examining a particularly irritating insect. And who are you to speak? Owen Young. I work for the Triple Creek Ranch, and I am a witness to what happened here tonight. A witness. Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless. How convenient that a nobody ranch hand thinks his word matters. It matters as much as any man's word, Owen said. Which is the whole problem, is it not? In this town, only some people's words count. Only some people get justice. Everyone else just has to accept whatever you decide is right. The saloon was dead silent. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. No one talked to Marcus Hewitt like that. No one challenged his authority, not if they wanted to keep their jobs, their homes, their lives intact. Marcus took a step closer to Owen, his face a mask of controlled fury. You are making a very serious mistake, Mr. Young. No, Owen said quietly. The mistake was made when your brother thought he could put his hands on a woman without consequences. The mistake would be compounding that by arresting her for defending herself. That is where the real mistake lies. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Marcus smiled, and it was worse than his anger had been. Sheriff, arrest them both. Him for interfering with the law, her for murder. Now hold on, Pete the bartender said, finally finding his courage. Marcus, the boy is right. Samuel was out of line. We all saw it. Did you? Marcus turned to face the crowd, his voice rising. Did all of you see my baby brother, who never hurt anyone, suddenly decide to attack a woman for no reason? Or is it more likely that she led him on, took advantage of him, and then shot him when he would not give her what she wanted? That is a lie. Victoria found her voice at last, anger burning through her fear. Your brother was a cheat and a drunk, and everyone in this room knows it. He grabbed me. He hurt me. She held up her wrist, showing the bruises already forming. I told him no, and he would not listen. My brother is dead, and you are standing here making excuses, Marcus said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. Sheriff, I am not going to ask again. Sheriff Crane looked around the room, clearly weighing his options. His job, his income, his entire life depended on staying in Marcus Hewitt's good graces. But there were a lot of people watching, and even a corrupt lawman had to maintain some semblance of legitimacy. I am going to have to take you in, Miss Randall, he said finally. Just for tonight, while we sort things out. It is for your own protection, really. Emotions are running high. And him? Marcus pointed at Owen. Mr. Young was just speaking as a witness, the sheriff said carefully. No crime in that. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Fine. But if I find out you are protecting a murderer, Sheriff, we are going to have problems. Victoria felt the men holding her arms begin to guide her toward the door. Her mind raced, trying to think of some way out, some escape from the nightmare her life had become in the space of a few minutes. She looked at Owen Young, this stranger who had spoken up for her, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. I will come by the jail in the morning, Owen called out as they led her away. To give my statement, to make sure the truth gets heard. You do that, Marcus said, his voice dripping with menace. We will see how long you keep telling your version of the truth. The night air hit Victoria's face as they led her outside, the cool desert breeze a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the saloon. The jail was just down the street, a small adobe building that had held more drunks than criminals in its 20-year existence. As they walked her toward it, Victoria glanced back once and saw Owen Young standing in the doorway of the saloon, watching her go. She did not know why he had spoken up for her. She did not know what he hoped to gain or what he was risking. But for the first time since the gun had gone off, she felt something other than terror. She felt the smallest spark of hope. The jail cell was exactly as miserable as she had imagined. A narrow cot with a thin mattress, a bucket in the corner, iron bars separating her from freedom. Sheriff Crane locked her in without ceremony and then disappeared into his office, leaving her alone in the dim light of a single oil lamp. Victoria sat on the cot and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from fear, though she was terrified. Not from regret because she would shoot Samuel Hewitt again if she had to. She cried from sheer exhaustion, from the weight of knowing that her life had changed irrevocably, that nothing would ever be the same. She thought about her mother, who would be worried sick when Victoria did not come home. She thought about Clara, who depended on Victoria to help with the bakery now that their father was gone. She thought about the future she had planned, the small dreams of maybe saving enough to expand the bakery, of finding a good man to marry, of building a quiet, stable life. All of that was gone now, shattered like glass on the floor of the Golden Rose Saloon. But she also thought about Owen Young, about the way he had stepped forward when no one else would. She thought about his words, about how he had challenged not just the sheriff, but Marcus Hewitt himself. It had been foolish, probably, and dangerous, certainly, but it had also been brave. It had been right. She was the first to stand up and say enough, to refuse to let Samuel Hewitt abuse her without consequence. And Owen Young had stood beside her, so she was not alone. That had to mean something. It had to. Victoria lay down on the uncomfortable cot and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the lamplight. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually exhaustion won out and she drifted into a fitful rest filled with dreams of gunshots and judgmental eyes. She woke to the sound of voices. Sunlight streamed through the single barred window, telling her that morning had come. She sat up, her body aching from the poor excuse for a bed, and listened. I am telling you, Sheriff, that woman needs to face a judge. Marcus Hewitt's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "I want her charged with murder." "And I am telling you that we have a problem," Sheriff Crane replied, sounding harried. "Half the town has come by this morning to say they saw what happened. They are all saying it was self-defense. Half the town." Marcus's voice was heavy with sarcasm. "Or one troublesome ranch hand who has gotten people riled up? Owen Young has been going door to door since dawn," another voice chimed in, one Victoria did not recognize. "Talking to everyone who was in the saloon last night, getting them to agree to make statements. He has got about 15 people willing to testify that Samuel drew first." Victoria felt her heart skip. Owen had spent the night gathering witnesses? For her? "Then arrest him for intimidation," Marcus snapped. "He is not intimidating anyone," Sheriff Crane said. "He is just talking to people. That is not illegal. Yet." The threat in Marcus's voice was clear. There was a long silence, then the sound of a door slamming. Footsteps approached the cell, and Sheriff Crane appeared, looking tired and irritated. "You have got yourself a champion, Miss Randall," he said, unlocking the cell door. "Against my better judgment, I am letting you go, but you are not to leave town. We will need you for the inquest." Victoria stood slowly, not quite believing what she was hearing. "I can leave?" "You can leave the cell," Crane clarified. "But Marcus Hewitt is not done with this. Not by a long shot. If I were you, I would watch my back." She walked out of the cell on shaky legs, half expecting it to be a trick, expecting to be grabbed and thrown back in. But Crane simply handed her the few possessions they had taken from her, her father's gun included, and gestured toward the door. "Go home to your mother," he said, "and stay out of trouble." Victoria stepped out into the bright morning sunlight and had to shield her eyes against the glare. The street was busier than usual, people moving about their daily business, but with a tension in the air that had not been there yesterday. She saw clusters of people talking, saw heads turn in her direction as she emerged from the jail. "Miss Randall." She turned to find Owen Young, leaning against the wall of the building next door, his hat pulled low against the sun. He straightened when he saw her, a slight smile touching his lips. "Mr. Young," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse and tears, "I hear I have you to thank for my freedom." "You have the truth to thank," he replied, falling into step beside her as she started walking toward home. "I just made sure people remembered it." They walked in silence for a moment, the sound of their boots on the hard-packed dirt, the only noise between them. Victoria studied him from the corner of her eye, this man who had become her unlikely defender. In the daylight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar on his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard work. He was probably in his late 20s, she guessed, with the kind of solid, dependable look that came from a life spent doing what needed to be done. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. "You do not even know me." Owen was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because I am tired of watching powerful men hurt people and face no consequences. Because someone had to be the first to say it was wrong." He glanced at her. "And because you were brave enough to defend yourself when you had to. That deserves support, not punishment." They had reached the small house behind the bakery where Victoria lived with her mother and sister. She could see curtains twitch in the window, knew her mother must be frantic with worry. "I need to go in," she said, then hesitated. "Mr. Young, you have put yourself in danger for me. Marcus Hewitt is not a forgiving man. He will come after you now." "Let him," Owen said, and there was steel in his voice. "I am not afraid of Marcus Hewitt. You should be. Maybe." He tipped his hat to her. "But some things are worth the risk. You take care, Miss Randall. And if you need anything, anything at all, you can find me at the Triple Creek Ranch, about 5 miles north of town." He turned to leave, and Victoria found herself calling after him. "Mr. Young, will I see you again?" He looked back at her. and this time his smile reached his eyes. "I reckon you will, Miss Randall. I reckon you will." Then he was gone, walking back toward the center of town with that same confident stride. Victoria watched him go, feeling something strange and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Then she turned and went inside to face her terrified mother and tearful sister. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and tension. The inquest was scheduled for the following week, which meant 7 days of waiting, of wondering, of watching over her shoulder for Marcus Hewitt's revenge. Victoria tried to return to normalcy, helping her mother with the bakery, going about her daily routines. But nothing felt normal anymore. The town had divided itself into camps. There were those who supported Victoria, who believed her account of what had happened, who were tired of the way the Hewitts ran Shafter like their personal kingdom. And there were those who sided with Marcus, either out of genuine loyalty, fear of losing their jobs, or simply because they could not imagine a world where a woman's word mattered more than a wealthy man's. Owen Young became a regular presence in her life during those days. He would stop by the bakery in the mornings, ostensibly to buy bread, but really to check on her, to let her know he was still gathering statements, still making sure people would speak the truth at the inquest. They would talk, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour if the bakery was quiet. Victoria found herself looking forward to these visits, to the calm, steady presence he brought with him. He told her about his life, about growing up on a small ranch in New Mexico, about losing his parents to disease and making his own way as a cattle driver and ranch hand. He had drifted through Texas for years, never staying anywhere long until he had ended up in Shafter 6 months ago and taken a job with the Triple Creek Ranch. "Why stay here?" Victoria asked him one morning as they sat on the bench outside the bakery, watching the town wake up. "You could go anywhere, do anything. Why stay in a place like this?" Owen considered the question, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I have spent a lot of years running," he said finally. "Moving from place to place, never putting down roots. I think maybe I am tired of running. I think maybe I want to find a reason to stay somewhere." The way he looked at her when he said it made Victoria's heart beat faster. She had not thought about romance, had not allowed herself to think about anything beyond surviving the inquest and keeping her family safe. But now, sitting next to this man who had risked everything to defend her, she felt something growing between them, something warm and real and terrifying in its intensity. "I am scared," she admitted quietly. "Marcus Hewitt has the whole town under his thumb. What if the inquest does not go our way? What if they rule it was murder?" "Then we fight," Owen said simply. "We appeal. We get a judge from out of town. We do whatever it takes. But I do not think it will come to that. Too many people saw the truth. Even in a town like this, the truth has power." "You have a lot of faith," Victoria said, wishing she could share his confidence. "I have faith in you," Owen replied, turning to face her fully. "You were brave enough to stand up when it mattered. That takes more courage than most people ever show in their whole lives. Whatever happens at the inquest, you should be proud of that." Their eyes met, and Victoria felt the world narrow down to just the two of them. She had known him less than a week, but it felt like longer. It felt like she had been waiting her whole life to meet someone who understood, someone who saw her as more than just a woman to be protected or controlled or dismissed. "Victoria," her mother's voice called from inside the bakery. "I need you to help with the morning batch." The moment broke, and Victoria stood reluctantly. "I should go." "I will see you tomorrow," Owen said, standing as well. "Same time?" "Same time," she agreed, and the smile they shared felt like a promise. But that afternoon, the fragile peace shattered. Victoria was in the back of the bakery, kneading dough, when she heard shouting from the street. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the front window, her mother and Clara close behind. A crowd had gathered in the town square. At the center of it, Victoria could see Marcus Hewitt on horseback, flanked by several of his mine workers. They had someone with them, someone whose hands were bound, whose face was bloody. It took her a moment to recognize Owen Young. No, she breathed, fear clutching at her chest. She ran out into the street, her mother calling after her, but she did not stop. She pushed through the growing crowd until she was at the front, until she could see clearly what was happening. Marcus Hewitt looked down at her from his horse, his expression triumphant. Miss Randall, how fitting that you should be here to see this. What have you done to him? Victoria demanded, looking at Owen. His left eye was swollen shut, blood dripped from a cut on his lip, and he moved like his ribs were injured. But when he saw her, he straightened, some of the pain leaving his expression. I am all right, Owen said, his voice rough but steady. Do not worry about me. Mr. Young here was caught trespassing on my property, Marcus said smoothly. My men apprehended him and brought him to me. We are taking him to the sheriff now to file charges. That is a lie, Owen said loudly, addressing the crowd that had gathered. I was on the public road that runs past the mine. Hewitt's men came after me, dragged me onto his property and beat me. This is retaliation for speaking the truth about what happened to Samuel Hewitt. A murmur ran through the crowd. People looked at each other, uncertainty and fear warring on their faces. This was Marcus Hewitt showing what happened to people who opposed him. This was a message, and everyone understood it clearly. You are making accusations you cannot prove, Marcus said calmly. My men will testify that you were trespassing. That is a crime. You will face consequences. Your men will testify to whatever you tell them to, Victoria said, finding her voice again. Just like you told the sheriff what to do, just like you have told this entire town what to do for years, but we are not all going to keep obeying anymore. Some of us are going to stand up and tell the truth, no matter what you do to try to stop us. Her voice had risen, carrying across the square. She was aware of people staring at her, aware that she was putting herself directly in Marcus Hewitt's crosshairs. But she could not stay silent. Not when Owen had stood up for her. Not when he was being hurt because he had defended her. Brave words, Marcus said, his voice cold. Let us see how brave you feel at the inquest, Miss Randall, when you are standing trial for the murder of my brother. It was not murder, Owen said again. And everyone here knows it. You can beat me, you can jail me, you can threaten anyone who speaks against you. But you cannot change the truth. Samuel Hewitt attacked Victoria Randall. She defended herself. That is what happened, and that is what I will testify to, no matter what you do. Marcus's face darkened with rage. For a moment, Victoria thought he might do something violent right there in the town square. But then he seemed to regain control, his expression smoothing back into cold calculation. Take him to the jail, he ordered his men. And as for you, Miss Randall, I would advise you to be very careful. Accidents happen, especially to people who make themselves troublesome. It was a direct threat, and everyone heard it. Victoria felt her mother's hand on her arm, pulling her back, but she resisted. She watched as Marcus's men hauled Owen away, watched him go without fighting, his eyes on her until the last moment. When the crowd began to disperse, Victoria found herself standing alone in the square, trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. This was the reality of life in Shafter. This was what justice looked like when one man held all the power. But something had changed inside her. The gunshot that had killed Samuel Hewitt had cracked open something that had been building for years, a resentment and anger at the unfairness of it all. And now, seeing Owen beaten and arrested for defending her, that crack had widened into a chasm. She was done being quiet. She was done accepting that this was just how things were. That evening, after the bakery had closed and her mother and sister had gone to bed, Victoria slipped out of the house. She made her way through the dark streets to the jail, her heart pounding. She did not have a plan exactly, but she needed to see Owen, needed to know he was all right. The jail was dark except for a single lamp burning in the window of Sheriff Crane's office. Victoria crept around to the side to where she knew the cell window was located. She had to stand on a wooden crate to see through the bars. Owen, she whispered into the darkness. There was a stirring inside. Then his face appeared at the window, bruised and swollen but breaking into a smile when he saw her. Victoria, he said softly, you should not be here. If Hewitt's men see you. I do not care, she interrupted. This is my fault. You are in here because of me. No, Owen said firmly. I am in here because Marcus Hewitt is a tyrant who cannot stand being challenged. That is not your fault. That is his choice. What are we going to do? Victoria asked, feeling helpless. He is going to win. He owns the sheriff. He owns half the town. How can we fight that? The same way you fought Samuel, Owen said, by refusing to back down, by standing up and saying enough. You were the first to do that, Victoria. You showed everyone in that saloon that it is possible to resist, to fight back. That matters. It matters more than you know. But what good does it do if you end up beaten and jailed? Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes. What good does it do if we lose everything? We have not lost yet, Owen pointed out. I will be out of here soon. These trespassing charges are nonsense. And even Crane knows it. And then we will face the inquest together. And we will tell the truth. And we will let the chips fall where they may. You make it sound so simple. It is not simple at all, Owen admitted. But it is right. And sometimes that is all we have to hold on to. He reached through the bars, his fingers finding hers in the darkness. I'm not going anywhere, Victoria. I'm going to stand beside you through all of this. I promise you that. His hand was warm and solid, and Victoria held on to it like a lifeline. Why? She asked again. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. Owen was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. Because from the moment I saw you standing in that saloon, refusing to be a victim, refusing to accept what Samuel Hewitt was trying to do to you, I knew you were someone special, someone worth fighting for. And because somewhere along the way, in these past few days, I have come to care about you, more than I probably should, given everything that is happening. But I cannot help it. I care about you, Victoria Randall. I care about what happens to you. Victoria felt her breath catch. In the darkness, with the bars between them and danger all around, this confession felt both impossible and inevitable. She had felt it too, this growing connection, this sense that Owen Young was someone she had been waiting for without knowing it. I care about you too, she whispered. I think I started caring about you the moment you stood up in that saloon and refused to let them take me without a fight. They stood there in the darkness, hands clasped through the bars, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It felt like coming home. When this is over, Owen said quietly, when we have gotten through the inquest and dealt with Marcus Hewitt and everything else, I want to court you properly. I want to take you to dinner, walk with you in the evening, get to know everything about you. Would that be all right? That would be more than all right, Victoria said, smiling through her tears. That would be wonderful. A sound from inside the jail made them both freeze. Owen squeezed her hand once more, then let go. You need to get out of here before Crane catches you. Go home. Stay safe. I will see you soon. Victoria nodded and climbed down from the crate. She hurried back through the dark streets, her heart lighter despite everything. Owen cared about her. He was going to stand by her. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The inquest was held the following Tuesday in the town hall, a large room that usually hosted dances and community meetings, but now served as an impromptu courtroom. A judge had been brought in from Fort Stockton, a gray-haired man named Harlan Pierce, who was known for being fair but stern. Victoria took that as a good sign. At least it would not be someone in Marcus Hewitt's pocket. The room was packed with people, everyone in Shafter seemingly determined to witness the proceedings. Victoria sat at the front with her mother and Clara on one side, Owen on the other. He had been released from jail after 2 days. The trespassing charges quietly dropped when it became clear that they would not hold up to scrutiny. The bruises on his face were fading to yellow and green, but they were still visible reminders of what speaking the truth had cost him. Marcus Hewitt sat on the opposite side of the room, surrounded by his men and his lawyer, a slick-looking man from San Antonio. He stared at Victoria with open hatred, and she forced herself not to look away. She would not be intimidated, not anymore. Judge Pierce called the proceedings to order, and the testimony began. The sheriff went first, describing the scene he had found at the Golden Rose Saloon. Then came the doctor, who had examined Samuel's body, confirming the single gunshot wound to the chest. Then came the witnesses. Marcus's lawyer called several people who testified that Samuel had been a good man, well-liked, never aggressive. They painted a picture of a harmless drunk who had perhaps gotten a bit too friendly, but meant no real harm. They suggested that Victoria had overreacted, had perhaps even planned the whole thing to get attention or money. Victoria listened to the lies with growing anger, but Owen placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Wait," he murmured. "Our turn is coming." And it did. When it came time for the defense, Owen's lawyer, a local man named Harold Vance, who had agreed to represent Victoria for a minimal fee, called witness after witness who told a very different story. They described Samuel's drunkenness, his aggressive behavior, the way he had grabbed Victoria. They confirmed that he had drawn his gun first, that Victoria had only fired to save herself. Owen testified last, and his words were clear and unequivocal. "I saw Samuel Hewitt assault Miss Randall. I saw him tear her dress and bruise her wrist. I saw him reach for his gun when she tried to get away. She fired in self-defense, pure and simple. And anyone who says different is either lying or was not paying attention." Marcus's lawyer tried to discredit him, suggesting he had reason to lie, that perhaps he and Victoria had planned the whole thing together. But Owen's testimony was too straightforward, too honest, and it was backed up by 15 other witnesses who all told the same story. Finally, Victoria herself took the stand. She was terrified, her hands shaking as she swore to tell the truth. But once she started talking, the words came easily. She described Samuel's behavior, the fear she had felt, the moment she had realized he was going to hurt her, whether she wanted him to or not. She described pulling the trigger, the terrible finality of it, the knowledge that she had taken a life. "I did not want to kill him," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted him to stop. I just wanted to be safe. That is all I wanted." When she was done, there was not a dry eye in the room. Even Judge Pierce looked moved. Marcus's lawyer tried to shake her testimony, but she held firm, repeating the truth over and over until it was undeniable. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, his expression was grave but clear. "Based on the testimony I have heard today," he said, his voice carrying through the silent room, "I find that Victoria Randall acted in self-defense. The death of Samuel Hewitt, while tragic, was the direct result of his own aggressive actions. Miss Randall is cleared of all charges and is free to go." The room erupted. Some people cheered, others protested, but the decision was final. Victoria felt her legs go weak with relief, felt her mother and sister grabbing her in a fierce hug. And then Owen was there, his arms around her, holding her up as she finally let herself cry. "It is over," he murmured into her hair. "You are safe. It is over." But it was not over. Not quite. Marcus Hewitt stood, his face a mask of cold fury. He pointed at Victoria, at Owen, at everyone who had testified against his version of events. "This is not justice," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is a travesty. My brother is dead, and you people think it is acceptable because some woman claimed she was scared. This town has lost its mind. This town has forgotten who provides the jobs, who keeps the economy running, who built this place into what it is, but you will remember. I promise you that. You will all remember." He stormed out, his men following. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Judge Pierce banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. damage was everyone knew that Marcus Hewitt was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. Over the next few weeks, Marcus made good on his threat. He laid off half the workers at his mine, claiming economic difficulties. He called in loans at his bank, forcing several families into foreclosure. He used every bit of power and influence he had to make life in Shafter as difficult as possible for anyone who had sided against him. But something unexpected happened. Instead of capitulating, instead of begging for forgiveness, the town began to fight back. Led by Victoria and Owen, people started organizing. They helped the families facing foreclosure, pooling their resources to pay off debts. They created new jobs, new opportunities that did not depend on Marcus Hewitt's goodwill. They reached out to mines and businesses in other towns, building connections that broke Marcus's monopoly on the local economy. It was slow, hard work. There were setbacks and struggles. But gradually, Shafter began to change. It began to become a town where justice mattered more than wealth, where people looked out for each other instead of looking the other way. And through it all, Victoria and Owen grew closer. Their courtship was unconventional, born out of crisis and struggle. But it was real. They would walk together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. They would work side by side, helping organize the town's resistance to Marcus's tyranny. They would steal moments alone, holding hands, sharing kisses that promised a future together. 6 months after the inquest, Owen asked Victoria to marry him. They were sitting on the bench outside the bakery, watching the sun set over the desert, when he turned to her and took her hand. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, "and I know the past few months have been difficult, but I cannot imagine my life without you anymore. You are the bravest, strongest, most incredible woman I have ever met, and I love you, Victoria Randall. I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me?" Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, throwing her arms around him. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, Owen Young. I love you so much." They were married in October of 1882, in a small ceremony at the church with the whole town in attendance. It was a celebration not just of their love, but of everything they had accomplished together, of the way they had stood up and refused to accept injustice. Marcus Hewitt did not attend. By then, his influence had waned considerably. Many of his workers had left to find jobs elsewhere. His mine was struggling, and his bank had lost most of its customers. He was still wealthy, still powerful, but he was no longer the absolute ruler of Shafter. The town had slipped from his grasp, and everyone knew it. Owen and Victoria moved into a small house on the edge of town, near the Triple Creek Ranch where Owen still worked. Victoria continued to help her mother and sister with the bakery, while also becoming more involved in town politics, advocating for fairness and justice for everyone. A year after their wedding, their first child was born, a boy they named Oliver. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, and he was the light of their lives. 2 years later came a daughter, Violet, who was as fierce as her mother and as kind as her father. Life was not always easy. There were still struggles, still moments of hardship, but Victoria and Owen faced them together, the way they had from that first night in the Golden Rose Saloon. They built a life based on mutual respect, on love, on the shared belief that standing up for what was right mattered more than taking the easy path. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of their home, watching Oliver chase Violet around the yard while the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Owen had his arm around Victoria, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. "The night everything changed?" "Sometimes," Owen admitted. "I think about how different things could have been. If I had not been there, if I had not spoken up, if you had not been brave enough to defend yourself." "I think about it too," Victoria said, "about how scared I was, about how alone I felt. And then you stood beside me, and suddenly I was not alone anymore. You changed my life that night, Owen. You saved my life." We saved each other, Owen corrected gently. You showed me what courage really looks like. You showed me what it means to stand up for yourself, even when it is terrifying. I was just following your lead. Victoria smiled and kissed him softly. We make a good team. The best team, Owen agreed. As the years passed, Shafter continued to grow and change. Marcus Hewitt eventually left town, selling his mine and bank and moving to El Paso. Some said he left because he could not stand being reminded of his lost power. Others said he left because he finally realized he had lost the only family he had, and the money and influence meant nothing in the end. Victoria did not know which version was true, and she did not particularly care. She was too busy living her life, raising her children, working with her husband to make Shafter a better place for everyone. By the time Oliver was 10 and Violet was 8, the town had transformed completely. New businesses had opened, new families had moved in, and the old culture of fear and intimidation had been replaced by something healthier. People looked out for each other. Justice was served fairly, and everyone knew the story of how it had started, of the night Victoria Randall had stood up and said enough, and the cowboy who had stood beside her so she was not alone. Victoria and Owen went on to have 2 more children, another son named Otto and a daughter named Vivian. Their house was always full of laughter and noise, of children playing and friends visiting. The bakery expanded, becoming one of the most successful businesses in town. Owen eventually became foreman of the Triple Creek Ranch, respected by everyone who worked with him. But no matter how busy their lives became, Victoria and Owen always made time for each other. They would take walks in the evening, holding hands and talking about their day. They would dance in the kitchen when the children were asleep, moving to music only they could hear. They would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out, grateful for everything they had built together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The whole town came, filling their house and yard with celebration. There were speeches and toasts, stories shared, and memories recalled. Victoria stood with Owen, surrounded by the life they had created, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered to him when they finally had a moment alone. For everything. For standing up for me when no one else would. For loving me. For building this life with me. Thank you, Owen replied, his eyes shining. For being brave enough to defend yourself. For showing me what it means to have courage. For loving me back. For giving me a reason to stay in one place. You are my home, Victoria. You always have been. They kissed, and their children groaned good-naturedly, and their friends laughed and cheered. And in that moment, surrounded by love and joy and community, Victoria knew that every struggle had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every hardship, every challenge had led her here, to this perfect moment, with this perfect man, in this life they had built together from courage and conviction. The town of Shafter, Texas, continued to thrive long after that anniversary celebration. It became known as a place where fairness mattered, where people stood up for each other, where justice was served regardless of wealth or influence. And at the heart of that transformation were 2 people who had refused to accept that might made right, who had stood together and said enough. Victoria and Owen grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They watched their children grow up and have families of their own. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, each new generation a testament to the life they had built. On a warm spring evening in 1922, exactly 40 years after that fateful night in the Golden Rose Saloon, Victoria and Owen sat on their porch one last time. Their bodies were old and worn, but their minds were sharp, and their love was as strong as it had ever been. We did all right, did we not? Victoria said, holding Owen's gnarled hand in her own. We did better than all right, Owen replied, his voice still carrying that note of quiet confidence that had first attracted her all those years ago. We did something that mattered. We changed things. We made the world a little bit better. We made our world better, Victoria agreed. And that is all anyone can really do. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the desert sky in shades of fire and gold. Their children and grandchildren were inside, the house full of noise and laughter. The town spread out before them, peaceful and prosperous, and between them was a love that had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and emerged stronger for it. Victoria leaned her head on Owen's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they watched the day fade into night together, the way they had done 1,000 times before. They had started as strangers thrown together by violence and injustice. They had become partners in resistance, then friends, then lovers, then husband and wife, then parents and grandparents. But through all of it, from that very first moment when Owen had stepped forward and refused to let Victoria stand alone, they had been something more fundamental than any of those labels. They had been two people who chose to do what was right, even when it was hard. Two people who stood up for each other, who believed in each other, who loved each other with a fierce and unwavering devotion. Two people who proved that courage could change the world, one stand at a time. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as the desert night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, Victoria and Owen Young sat together in perfect peace, knowing that they had lived a life worth living, that they had loved and been loved in return, and that their story would echo through the generations to come. It was, in the end, the happiest of endings, not because their lives had been easy, but because they had faced every difficulty together, not because they had been perfect, but because they had always striven to be better, not because they had avoided pain and struggle, but because they had found joy and meaning despite it all. The town of Shafter remembered them long after they were gone. The story was passed down through families, told to children and grandchildren, a reminder of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept injustice. The house they had lived in remained standing, a monument to their love and their courage, and the changes they had helped bring about, the culture of fairness and community they had nurtured, continued to shape the town for decades after. But more than the legacy, more than the stories, more than the historical impact, what mattered most was the simple truth at the heart of it all. On a spring night in 1882, a woman had stood up and said enough, and a cowboy had stood beside her so she was not alone. And from that one moment of courage and solidarity had grown something beautiful and lasting and true. Love, real love, the kind that changes lives and moves mountains. Justice, hard-won and fiercely protected. Community, built on mutual support and shared values. And a life lived with purpose, with meaning, with joy. That was the story of Victoria Randall and Owen Young. That was the legacy they left behind. And that was the proof, written in the years they shared and the love they built, that standing up for what is right, even when it is terrifying, even when you might have to do it alone, is always worth it. Because sometimes, if you are very lucky, you do not have to stand alone at all. Sometimes there is a person who will step forward, who will put themselves at risk, who will say, without hesitation or doubt, I am with you. I believe you. I will stand beside you no matter what comes. And when you find that person, when you recognize them for the gift they are, when you build a life with them based on mutual respect and unwavering support, then you have found something more precious than silver or gold. You have found love in its truest, purest form. That was what Victoria and Owen had. That was what they gave to each other, from that first night until their last day. And that was what made their story, for all its violence and struggle and hardship, ultimately a story of hope. A story that proved things could change, that people could be better, that love could triumph over injustice. In the years that followed their passing, their great-grandchildren would visit Shafter and hear the stories. They would walk the streets their ancestors had walked, visit the saloon where it all began, stand in the town square where Victoria had confronted Marcus Hewitt, and they would feel proud, knowing that their family history was one of courage and conviction, of standing up for what was right even when it cost everything. The bakery that Victoria's mother had started continued to operate, passed down through the generations. The Triple Creek Ranch, where Owen had worked, still existed, though it had changed hands several times, and the small house on the edge of town where they had raised their children became a local landmark, preserved as a reminder of the people who had lived there and the love they had shared. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simplest one. In Shafter, Texas, and in towns all across the West that heard the story, people remembered the lesson that Victoria and Owen had taught, that one person standing up and saying enough could spark a change, that supporting that person standing beside them could make all the difference. That courage was contagious, that justice was worth fighting for, and that love, real love, was the strongest force in the world. So when the people of Shafter faced injustice in their own time, in their own ways, they remembered. They remembered the woman who had defended herself and refused to be ashamed. They remembered the man who had stood up for her when no one else would. And they tried, in their own small ways, to live up to that example, to be brave when it mattered, to stand beside the vulnerable, to speak truth even when it was dangerous, to build a community based on fairness and mutual respect, to love fiercely and honestly and completely. Those were the lessons of Victoria and Owen. Those were the gifts they left behind. And those were the truths that turned their story from a moment of violence and fear into a legend of love and courage that would inspire generations to come. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the gunshot in the saloon, not the inquest, not even the dramatic confrontation with Marcus Hewitt. What mattered was the quiet, steady love that grew between two people who had stood together when it counted. What mattered was the family they built, the community they nurtured, the life they lived with purpose and joy. What mattered was that Victoria had been brave enough to defend herself, and Owen had been brave enough to defend her. And together, they had proven that courage and love could change the world. And on warm spring evenings in Shafter, when the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and fire, people would still tell the story. They would speak of the night that started it all, of the woman who said enough and the cowboy who stood beside her. They would remember the love that grew from that moment, the life that was built, the legacy that remained. And in remembering, they would be inspired to be brave in their own lives, to stand up for what was right in their own ways, to build their own stories of courage and love and justice, because that was the real magic of Victoria and Owen's story. It was not just their story. It was a story for everyone who heard it, a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that standing up mattered, that love conquered all, that justice, though hard to achieve, was always worth fighting for. And so the story lived on, passed from generation to generation, a light in the darkness, a hope in times of despair, a reminder that courage existed, that love endured, and that standing together made all the difference. Victoria Randall and Owen Young had started as two people thrown together by circumstance and violence. They had become heroes, legends, symbols of resistance and justice. But most importantly, they had become partners in the deepest sense of the word, building a life together based on mutual respect, unwavering support, and a love that grew stronger with each passing year. Their story was proof that the best love stories were not the ones that came easily, but the ones that were forged in fire and struggle, that were tested and found true, that endured despite every obstacle and emerged more beautiful for it. And in the end, as they sat together on their porch and watched the sun set on a life well lived, Victoria and Owen knew that they had been blessed beyond measure, not because their lives had been easy, but because they had lived them together, not because they had avoided pain, but because they had faced it as one, not because the world had been kind, but because they had made their own kindness, their own joy, their own perfect happiness. That was their triumph. That was their legacy. That was the story that would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of courage, the strength of solidarity, and the eternal truth that love, real love, the kind that stands beside you in your darkest hour and refuses to let you fall, was worth everything. And so their story ends, not with sadness, but with joy, not with regret, but with satisfaction, not with an ending, but with a legacy that would live on forever. The story of a woman who said enough, a man who stood beside her, and the love that changed everything.